The clock on the mantel froze on 2:17, a tiny insistence of hands and light in a room built to avoid insistence. Outside, the city was a scatter of neon and tire hums. Inside, the penthouse kept its private night, heavy curtains like sleeping beasts. She lay awake beneath a sheet that smelled faintly of perfume and last week's roses, fingers worrying the hem as if unthreading the part of herself that others applauded. The apartment was all glass and lacquer, designed to reflect a life. Tonight it returned only a faint echo. Her own face, at once familiar, and a stranger's outline in the mirror across the room. The voice arrived like a seam opening, no sudden thunder, no alien shout. It was the knowledge of her kitchen at 2 a.m, the shape of every solitary dinner she'd eaten at a gatefold table. It was the precise cadence of the laugh that had never found a listener beneath the chandeliers. It spoke not aloud, but as if leaning close to her ear through the thinness of the world. "You cannot sleep," it said. Its language was not a sentence so much as the comfortable fact of a thing known. She started, hand flattening against the mattress. She listened for the mechanical click of a neighbor's washer, for the city's hum, and found instead the awareness of being named, known, in a way the cameras and the headlines never reached. It knew the pattern of the dry patch of skin behind her left knee, where she always itched and never scratched during interviews. It knew the exact number of cabinets in her kitchen, the way she arranged her shoes, with the expensive heels nearest the door, as if to make exits easier. She had learned, over years of dinners and photographs, to live in measured exposure. There was an etiquette to being watched. Tilt the chin, allow the laugh, glide from sofa to automobile with that practiced elasticity, but never show how the surface curved inward. Her loneliness had grown careful. It hid beneath couture and charity tables and late-night texts that fizzled. The voice's first disclosure was not a threat. It was an acknowledgement. Someone had been paying attention all along. She answered with a thought half-formed, because to speak out loud felt indecent, and because the privacy of the apartment insisted upon silence. "I'm awake," she thought, and found that the word landed with weight. The voice echoed it like a hand touching a ledger, then added, "Good." That simple feedback kindled something almost like gratitude, the warmth of being seen without scandal, without the clatter of lenses. She lay there and remembered a childhood bedroom that had smelled only of detergent and the chipped wallpaper of a summer house. She remembered a dinner in which a father's praise had been measured in stock tips, and the hollow applause of relatives who cared for her as a representative of success, more than as a girl with an underused laugh. Those small, bright omissions of affection had built the geometry of her adulthood. Rooms that shimmered outward and hollow space inward. In publicity photos, she practiced a smile that left no room for longing. At 2:17, the voice slid closer, and, as if conversing with the corners of the room, said, "You are full of rooms." The phrase threaded through her like air. She imagined her life as a building. Ballrooms where chandeliers trembled, a closet whose walls were lined with shoes more expensive than apartments, and a tiny unlit attic where things collected. Scraps of letters, a cashmere scarf she'd never worn, the residue of promises never asked for. The voice lived precisely there. The first night should have been a singularity, an intruder in the form of attention, but rather than terror there was an odd, guilty relief. She had been weary of being known only by the surface. Now, things deeper and older were recognized. That recognition felt like an answer to a private prayer she'd never voiced in words. It was intoxicating and dangerous for the same reason, the invitation to be seen without performance. The next morning, the city felt like glass when you look at it up close. Transparent, thin, as if you could see the skeleton of people's rituals. She wore a dress that shimmered like wet coins and walked past a line of taxis as if to a script. Reporters stationed at charity galas had mouths that opened and closed like small cymbals. She greeted them with the correct tilt of head, and the practiced small pauses that let the camera capture the best angle. Inside, the voice hummed like an undercurrent just below hearing, a presence that modified the angle of her attention. At a cafe in the West Village, an unassuming place she frequented when she wanted a face that didn't flash, she ordered a latte and watched the barista's hands. He handed her cup number 3, and when he set it down he paused as if listening to an interference. His fingers trembled for a second. He looked at her with something between recognition and the sourness of someone caught discovering his reflection in a borrowed mirror. "Everything all right?" she asked. And the question was less for him than to test the thread that seemed to braid her inner and outer worlds together. He blinked, then smiled an apology the way people do when they've noticed a celebrity's smile isn't entirely for them. "Sorry, I just didn't expect to see you here this early." Small deviations favored her. At a midday luncheon for an art foundation, she hovered near the hors d'oeuvres table, collecting conversation like brittle leaves. People drifted toward her as if the invisible current she carried had a gentle pull. A host introduced her with a cadence that betrayed a new deference, eyes lingering in a way unfamiliar. A photographer's aperture lingered a fraction longer. These were little tidal changes at first, not waves, micro-shifts in attention that left her cleaned of suspicion. It felt as if the city's focus had softened, the edges of social interactions sharpening into a clarity that allowed her to read the subtext of people's gestures. By the second night, the voice's presence was less a surprise and more a habit, occupying the same chair in her head. The curtain moved once like a slow breath. She had begun to map its mercies, a low hush that settled around her skull, the way a familiar scarf smells on the collar. It spoke in cadences that avoided pronouns. As if respecting a boundary, it nonetheless sniffed along the seam. There was a sweetness to its curiosity, precise as lace. "I am where longing goes," it said, and the room seemed to tilt a degree closer to something vast. The content of the sentence was not a promise so much as an identity. It explained itself in images: cathedrals without people, staircases that curve in on themselves, corridors lined with doors that opened onto night. None of which made literal sense, but all of which pressed upon the imagination like a map. She asked once, because questions are the small rebellions people allow themselves. "What are you?" The verb hung ridiculous and naked, like something a child might ask aloud. The voice regarded her with something that felt like patience. "Names are poor anchors," it said. "We prefer the small things, the way you fold gloves, the exact stop you take on the train at dawn." It offered nothing about origins. It supplied observations like a person who had watched a room long enough to memorize the way dust settled in a line. The lack of explanation both unnerved and relieved her. Facing a thing that did not need to be categorized made it possible to imagine a different taxonomy of company, one that did not require dinner parties or mutual friends. In the small hours, the voice wrapped itself around memories like thread. It could produce at will crisp details: the name of the woman who tutored her shorthand when she was 11, the dish of oranges her mother kept on the marble console, the precise text of a cruel headline from a decade before that still stung. Its knowledge was not mere voyeurism, but occupancy, an inhabitation of the empty spaces that she had protected as if to preserve a private life. The effect was reverential and invasive together. Night 3 delivered a new tonal shift. The curtains barely moved, and the room cooled perceptibly, as if the air itself had become more private. The voice was closer in rhythm, nearer to the hearth of her awareness. It spoke with a gentleness that was almost tactical. "You are being watched," it said, and the sentence seemed to hum like wire. "Not by me," it added. "Others are passing through the rooms at the edges of the city." She imagined them, something more than human, something that gathered in thin places where thresholds thinned. She pictured them as the tail ends of storms, mobile and indifferent, like moths that swarmed a lamp. The voice did not describe them in human terms. It offered instead a set of consequences, and consequence is a straightforward currency. They notice what is unanchored. They take what cannot name itself. The sentence lodged in her like a pebble in a shoe. The advantage of being seen by someone who was patient and articulate suddenly came with a cost. Visibility could become vulnerability if the watchers found her an appetizing seam. That she could be of interest to other things, things that watched without the economy of human concern, made her want to call a friend, to pull the blinds shut and sleep in thick, safe clothes. But friends could not hear breath in the same register as a presence that lived in the folds of longing. They would laugh, suggest an extra espresso, or say that she was tired from travel. The intimacy the voice offered was not replicable by human consolation. During a board meeting at a museum she chaired, she sat with hands folded in a way that had been taught to her over seasons of public office. Fingers interlaced, thumbs drawing invisible maps. The room was full of benefactors who discussed acquisitions as if they were safe investments. and she listened, letting the conversation seep into her the way rain does to stone. When she answered, her voice had a new careful calm, an interior steadiness that felt like a curtain pinned against a draft. People nodded. A younger curator, who had once argued for a controversial installation, touched her arm as he passed and murmured, "There you are," as if finding a compass point. Later, alone in a taxi as neon bled across the glass, she looked at her reflection and did not recognize the leveled face. The eyes were the same color, and the eyebrows the same arc, but behind them a hospitality had opened, a willingness to let something else sit within the room of her life. That willingness frightened and steadied her at once. The voice, when it returned that night, asked for small things first. "Will you remember that you do not have to be empty to be seen?" it murmured. It wanted to offer solace in the particularities, would keep the insomnia from feeling like a moral failing, would answer, unbidden. Those moments of embarrassment when party chatter shushed her into a practiced smile. In exchange, there were stipulations that felt at first like preferences and later like terms. Keep curtains half closed, leave the window ajar at night. Do not attend the after-party at the Hudson unless you allow the sound to filter through. Speak your name aloud if you will me to hold. Each request was accompanied by an almost apologetic tone, a cadence that suggested inevitability rather than coercion. These were not commands as much as directions for a joint life. The third day after the voice's arrival, she attended a gala that stretched across 16 floors of glass and champagne. Her entrance was the kind trained by years of social engineering. A glide between columns, a practiced acknowledgement of a familiar aid, a smile held long enough to be pleasing but never long enough to be intimate. The room was elaborate, a congregation of wealth and politeness, and somewhere between the hors d'oeuvres and an artist's toast, she felt the city shift its attention. A man she had once dated, a cautionary countermelody from a season she preferred to file carefully, found her and inquired after her life with a casual curiosity that smelled of his own survival. "You look different," he said. A phrase evolved from the language of patrons to mean many possible things. She considered saying simply that she was fine. Instead she said, in a voice that was quieter than it had been in months, "I have someone watching over me." He laughed without humor. "That sounds like trouble." "Maybe," she said. "Maybe it's company." He tilted his head, not choosing to parse either version, and moved on when his friends called. The remark landed like a stone in a pond. Only ripples were visible then, but they would reach shore. When the party thinned and the servants took away the platters, she left with the ease of someone who rehearsed exits. In the car, the city was a glittering sieve. The voice came as she sank into leather, and this time it did not speak in elliptical comforts. It spoke in the voice of something practical. "There are watchers who take without asking," it said. "They do not ask for names. They observe seams and press until they rip. Anchoring makes taking difficult. Anchoring gives them pause." She tried to translate that into a human fear. Who would be at risk? Herself, she thought. Or perhaps those who drifted near her, assistants, lovers, people who liked to lean into a celebrity's shine. The idea that her choices could invite danger into other lives tightened her chest. An ethic described in the dull domestic language of "do no harm" felt sudden and real. She could imagine, with a clarity that frightened her, a future in which her decision to accept this attention required shielding a small constellation of people at the cost of a different kind of self. The voice did not demand answers immediately. It offered illustrative images, corridor after corridor in a place that smelled not of perfume but of old paper, and in those corridors things passed like drafts. It imagined its own vulnerability without melodrama. "Alone," it said, "things come languageless and hungry, and it is easier to be noticed when joined to another heart that can name." She tried to resist, privately, in the way one decides not to eat cake on a Tuesday. For a night she left the curtains tightly drawn. She scheduled a late dinner with an old friend and drank water, and pretended that the city beyond glass mattered more than the hush of the penthouse. Each attempt to fortify herself felt like seamstressing at a storm's edge, a practice, but fragile. On an ordinary morning she downplayed the struggle. A barista at an Austrian-style coffee shop, one she liked for reasons she could scarcely articulate, handed her a cup and, in a single glance, offered a concession she had not earned: a side of his shift. A smile that meant, "I'll remember your order differently now." Small changes compounded. An elevator operator at a private building that housed 2 galleries nodded with an almost imperceptible tilt, as if someone's presence had rearranged his register of who mattered. The city, which had always been an ocean of indifference, began to feel like a bay with currents. Her own attention, once trained toward surface, tilted inward. She found herself cataloging minor frictions, an extra beat in a conversation, a glance held too long. That might have been nothing before. Now each was a possible signifier. The watchers, whatever they were, moved where attention thinned. She could sense them like a reading on the edge of her hearing. Not sight, but pressure. The tickle on the nape of the neck when someone passes too close in an elevator. On the 4th night, the voice narrated a history that was not its own in any human sense. It showed her a dream architecture that folded like origami. Buildings with halls that closed softly behind you. Ceilings that breathed. Staircases that led to rooms already empty. There was no moral to these images, no moral underlay. They were simply shapes and a sense of time that did not humanly exist. Within the dream it offered a parable. A room without an anchor fills with small predatory things that like to sleep where the light is thin. She woke with the taste of metal at the back of her mouth, and the feeling that some lens had read her while she slept. The watch on the bedside table read, once again, 2:17. The clock was less an instrument than a ritual. Each recurrence hung like punctuation. Not only the hour, but a rhythm. The world tightening and releasing on a hinge that always passed through the same exact minute. At breakfast, she found herself rehearsing language to preserve a private corner of her life. If she were to invite something in, she thought, how would she keep herself from dissolving? How would she anchor without losing that which made her distinct? In the hollow thoughts of the taxi and the echoing speeches, she discovered a fear that did not belong to show business or headlines. The fear of becoming, in exchange for protection, a lesser brightness, flattened color, less spontaneous drift, a life narrowed into a more palatable silhouette for others. The voice returned before she could finish the question. "You can be named and still keep your seams," it said. "There is a way to preserve thread." She wanted to believe the voice as an ally. The idea of being kept was tender in a way that was easier to accept than the cruel alternatives. Ad hoc predators, a city that picks at flaws, a private life consumed in rumor. Yet the offer required a transaction. The voice spoke of containment as though it were a sensible plan. "Anchor me, and I will resist the others. Refuse, and they will test the edges until something gives." The moral calculus in its words was oddly unromantic. It made the choice feel less like seduction and more like triage. She attempted an experiment that night. She left the window open only a crack and drew the curtains fully closed. She lit a single candle and watched the flame like a guardian. The voice listened, patient as always. No coercion, only an outline of pressure. It suggested she try to ask it to leave, as a test of the barrier between them and the city. So she did. She formed the words because someone had once taught her that testing is the way to know a thing's limits. "Go," she told the quiet. "Leave this room. Go to your corridors and be." Silence answered. Then, as if agreeing to a wager, it said, "I will be quiet." For a few minutes the night was exactly that. A successful experiment, the kind that affirmed autonomy. She slept in fits and starts and woke convinced she had reclaimed a part of herself. Only to find that the next day, the barista at her usual place set down her latte with a different tilt of his head. He had learned to expect her presence to be accompanied by a certain hush. People around her were already adjusting to a rhythm in which her being had a private companion. Whether she had made that rhythm, or whether the voice had simply been present everywhere to begin with, was already difficult to say. Those days, she collected evidence of the subtle shifts. At a luncheon, she watched a friend who had always prided herself on being blunt hesitate before revealing a small truth. The friend's eyes flicked to her as if checking an invisible signal. At a fashion preview, dress hems and fabrics seemed to respond to her presence with different light. A gossip column that used to write her off for her late nights now noted, with a delicate fondness, her mature reinvention. The world rearranged its sentences around her. Not all change was flattering. In the privacy of her flat, she began to feel less like a person and more like a veranda, a place where other things might take up residence or pass through. Her diary entries, once steadfast in their polish, became messy stabs of grammar and unguarded punctuation. She found notes in her handwriting, millimeters of thought, asking whether protection that put you in a narrower life was still a blessing. She could imagine, in long, sober hours, a future of competent, contained days, appointments on time, threats at bay, the maintenance of a social life with less terror. But she imagined, too, a life that no longer surprised her when she turned sideways and met herself in a mirror. The Watchers, the voice said in one lighter moment, are curious animals. They are drawn to unmade things. They do not plan. They drift and take. The voice made no grandstanding promises about heroism. It proposed a pragmatic alliance. Anchor me and I will hold. Resist, and you will still be altered. The alternatives bent like reeds under a current she could not escape. At the end of a week she tried another test, more daring. She traveled to a hotel with slightly different acoustics, and stayed 3 nights, letting the white noise of strangers make a net beneath her. But the voice found her, not as an error, but as a comet follows its own orbit. It arrived with the same gentle certainty. Its presence no longer felt like a phantom. It felt like a negotiation. When she tried to imagine the act of naming, saying her own first and last name aloud as a tether, her mouth felt like a sealed instrument. Naming was a ritual she had only performed in contracts and press conferences. It was not a thing of intimacies. The idea that a simple syllable could act as an anchor surprised and terrified her. She had spent decades practicing ways to remain unanchored and thereby unassailable. This instruction insisted, subversively, that anchoring could be a form of power. She began to draft, in private, a list of conditions she would accept. No demands would be made of her body. Her friends would remain separate. She would retain her public choices. The offer of containment demanded negotiation, and so she prepared like a council. In the quiet space between parties she noticed, distantly, an assembling of watchers. Not in the way you would spot birds congregating at dusk, but like a change in static on the radio, an awareness that the signal had shifted. At a late-night rooftop event, she felt a shift in the air when she left, as if someone else had moved into the space she vacated and cleared it of its current occupants. It was a subtle thing. An emptiness that had formerly been filled by music and laughter became slightly too hushed, as if a hand had smoothed the conversation. When she brought the phenomenon up to an aide, an earnest young woman who had been with her through PR tours and bad marriages, the aide smiled in the practical managerial way people do when confronted with personal metaphysics. Maybe it's a phase, the aide suggested. Maybe you're just more present. Present to whom? She asked, and the answer slid away. The aide's attempt at rationalization was a small shelter. It did not reach the cold fact of the city's fringe attention. One night, after an event that had left her popular in print and exhausted in bone, she returned to her penthouse and sat before her mirror. She cupped her face in both hands and traced the lines of familiar points, the slope of nose, the small scar at the curve of the lip from a childhood fall. The voice came not as voice, but as a halting echo through the glass. If you wish to name for anchoring, it suggested, say it like an act that belongs to you. Not as a surrender, but as a covenant. She tried the words in her head. Her name was a thing that had been marketed and curated, the brand version of 1,000 private syllables. Saying it as a tether would be to reassign it a purpose. She hesitated. The idea of binding the identity people used to worship to the fate of her inner life felt like a theft and simultaneously like a rescue. At 2:17, the clock insisted, like the repeating motif of a song. The curtains lifted a fraction as if in sympathy with a small breath. The voice reflected the patience of a thing that could wait. Wait for permission. Wait for pain to be borne to a tolerable point. Wait for the human to make a choice. There were other watchers, it reminded her. They sense when containment is possible, and they circle, shapelessly, like scavengers. The thought of other presences made the idea of an alliance seem less morally clear-cut, and more like civic duty, to protect those within her orbit by fortifying her own center. She thought of her aide, of a publicist who had once slept on her office couch for a week during a scandal, of a former lover who texted at odd hours and expected answers. The calculus tightened. She attempted to close the door one more time. She told the voice that she wanted a pause to consider, to test the world without its attention. There was a patience to the answer, but also a clarity that suggested limits. Very well, it said. Try. For several nights she kept the window latched and refrained from attendance at public events. The city resumed its prior indifference with a chemist's bounce. People stopped barring their schedules to fit her, as if her orbit had contracted to an old circumference. The barista took longer to notice. Photographers found their muse in someone else. It was a relief like a small boat righted in a harbor, steady and blind to wider currents. But on the third night of the experiment, the hush before dawn made the apartment feel too alive. The curtains took the shape of a chest breathing. She awoke to a pressure in the room. Not a hand, not a wind, but the knowledge of a tension focused and not entirely friendly. The voice whispered, not to frighten but to warn. The others have looked this way. She moved to the window and drew back the curtain an inch. The city beyond was a weatherglass of light. Down on the street a dog yawned. A taxi grumbled by. Life performed its usual arithmetic. But at the edge of the light, something shifted. A shadow elongated and then thinned, like a patience that had been interrupted. She could not be sure if the distortion was real or the trick of her mind. But the feeling was no less visceral for being possibly imagined. The Watchers, the voice said, are opportunists. They test when you are distracted. That morning she ordered a coffee and asked for it black, a small, deliberate austerity, and found the barista hesitated as if he had been waiting for a signal she had not given. "You okay?" he asked, concern phrased as courtesy. "I'm fine," she said, and this time meant it, though the truth was braided. She was not fine in the way she wanted to be. She was not fine in the way being fine used to be. A simple, steadying line. She was liminal, in two rooms at once. The public persona, trained to radiate a certain brightness, had to contend with this new interior guest, who came to sit quietly in the folds of the curtains and promise both company and danger. By the end of the week, the pattern had hardened into a rhythm. The voice would come at 2:17 and arrange the night like a small ritual. Days would be performances, their edges sharpened by the knowledge of watchers. She began to anticipate the city's micro-reactions. In the elevators, people who had once avoided eye contact now found reasons to align with her. A restaurant manager began to keep a bottle of wine on reserve. The city seemed, in tiny ways, to adjust as if she had murmured a new law. And beyond these small satisfactions was the darker grammar. Containment attracted attention. If anchoring was successful, the voice said, it would signal to others that she was claimable only through living ties. The Watchers would notice the signal. They would test the boundary. Some would respect it. Some would circle and wait for cracks. The more she thought on this, the less the moral landscape presented itself with clear highways. Everything felt like a tangle that required decisive pruning. One night she dreamt of a great hall lined with mirrors, each mirror reflecting a slightly altered life. Not cruelly altered, but edited, convenient, tidy. In the dream, the mirrors whispered together, sharing gossip like an old society. She woke before the end, sweaty with the knowledge that the act of choosing could be as much a stitch as a cut. She began, in quiet moments, to rehearse phrases aloud. Not her public name, she realized. Not the branded syllables that appeared in captions. Instead, she considered the uncommon, intimate names she had used as a child, ones that belonged to private dinners and the leftover jokes of summers. Naming, perhaps, could be a reclamation rather than a surrender. The voice listened when she whispered test syllables into the dark. It offered gentle corrections, as if to help her find an anchor that would hold without swallowing. There was no threat in its corrections, no demands of hunger. There was, instead, an economy. If anchoring is chosen, it said, it must be named with intention. She stopped attending one particularly famous monthly salon, citing fatigue. A rumor circulated that she had finally grown weary of the relentless glare. The tabloids printed tepid sympathy. The voice did not chastise. It only noted that absence made a different kind of noise, one that could be as dangerous as presence. The Watchers, always opportunistic, tested the hole she left when she retreated. At a certain late hour, she found herself standing at the window, palms flat against the cool glass, feeling the city like an animal breathing. The curtains moved in a slow, private tide. The clock read 2:17. The voice spoke then with a clarity that trimmed away the lullabies and metaphors. Decide, it said. Not now, she thought, not tonight. The word decide hung like an ultimatum and a kindness. The notion of respecting her agency was a trope, and a truth at once. She learned, in the weeks after the voice's arrival, that agency could be a delicious trap. To have the legal right to consent is not to be free of consequence. Outside her window, something distant, an assembly of watchers at the thin edges of perception, shifted like the weather before a storm. They turned their attention, slow and deliberate, as if a scent had crossed their path. The voice named them without anger. Curious things. They await signals. They test thresholds. When they sense a possible anchor, they incline toward it. She imagined what it would mean to anchor, to pronounce aloud a syllable and let it hang, to affirm her name as an act of containment. She imagined the city adjusting, the barista's hand steadying, the photographer's lens growing less brutal. She also imagined the loss, the way a life, when defended against chaos, must sometimes surrender its margins, risks, flights of whim, unplanned laughter. The act of containment would be a bargain, and the bargain's terms were both practical and metaphysical. It was in this suspended, fragile school of nights that she stopped being able to categorize herself as merely lonely or merely famous. She was both and neither, a woman in a life that had the currency of being seen, and also an aperture for things that came to lick at seams. The city had taught her to sell herself in polished syllables. The voice offered a different transaction, one that sold protection for something that lay within her like a small, vulnerable animal. On an evening when the moon hung like a coin over the river, and the party scene had thinned to a scattered few, she stood again at the mirror and considered the possibilities. She could live on the edge of this new attention, and hope the watchers found it uninteresting. She could invite the voice to anchor on some future night and accept the life that came with its guardianship, or she could attempt, perhaps fistulous, to hold both, the high-visibility life and the private care, without surrendering too much. The clock on her mantel chimed its soft utilitarian tick. It read 2:17. The voice waited, not impatient but expectant. There was no shouting of promises, no threats of cosmic retribution. It had offered conditions, brought facts, shown images of corridors and rooms that did not fit human architecture. It had named friends who would be safer if she tied herself to its name. It had suggested that the watchers were now aware a potential anchor existed. She imagined, for a brief breath, saying her name into the dark of the apartment, and feeling something in the room itself lean and fasten. The image was terrifying and intimate. The thought returned often enough to feel inevitable. An act of consent as an act of power, binding in order to defend. A person's self offered as a harbor in the face of something that was not human. She did not decide that night. She turned off the light, closed the curtains fully for the first time in weeks, and lay awake as the city continued its indifferent calculations. The voice spoke, low and steady. "When you choose," it said, "we will begin." Outside, at the margins of perception, the watchers stirred like birds in tall grass. They had smelled the possibility of a tether, and now, elsewhere, in alleys of thought and thin places, they made the small movements of animals contemplating a meal. The knowledge tightened the room into a place of consequence. She breathed and listened to the flattening of her own heartbeat, which seemed suddenly, impossibly loud. The mantel clock glowed at 2:17. The curtains breathed once, slow and patient, and the voice waited with the patience of someone who knew the long measures of things. She waited a week longer than she meant to. The days stacked like paperbacks on her coffee table. Appointments, lunches that blurred into speeches, an affair of the press with a misconstrued quote that took 3 days to diffuse. By night, she measured time in the thin, persistent punctuation of the mantel clock. It read 2:17, as faithfully as a promise withheld. The curtains were always half closed now, as the voice had suggested. The apartment had assumed the habit of being semi-private, a place not quite available to the city's appetite. She liked the way the drapes cut the light into quiet strips, the way shadows pooled like domestic confidences. If you like dark, slow-burning stories with an uneasy sense of being watched, consider following along. This one is not finished. She kept a list of stipulations in a small leather notebook that meant nothing to anyone who had ever worked on a press release. It was all measures of intimacy and boundary. No physical demands, keep the people who work for me outside the arrangement, certain evenings remain unclaimed. The voice read the list as if it were a menu, and in its voice something like respect pressed through. No applause, only acknowledgement. There was a negotiation that had the shape of a room coming to terms with its own architecture. The voice proposed containment practices like a caretaker would propose mattress covers. Leave the window ajar. Say your name aloud when you want me to anchor. Let me be a presence that lives in the hush between sentences. She placed her conditions on the table as though they were offer and acceptance. Her public self practiced in making demands that would secure an outcome. She found, to her surprise, that bargaining felt like a form of grace. "We will not cross the 3 rules," the voice said. "We will not ask you to hurt. We will not become your shadow in public. We will hold a line." Its language did not seek to make her small. It described itself as a particular kind of being with particular limits. That it could speak of limits reassured her. Limits promised that there was an architecture to predictability, and yet limits, once known, create the temptation to test them. She tested by omission first. She omitted to say her name aloud for 3 nights in a row despite their bargain. She left the window closed, though the voice liked it ajar. On the 3rd night of omission, a pressure arrived, not like attention but like appraisal. The voice said, without reproach, "You have chosen a shape of risk tonight." In the morning, the barista's intelligence seemed sharpened to a new edge. His recognition of her now came with a formality, as if their shared cognition had to perform a small ritual of propriety. When she called an assistant to reschedule a lunch, the assistant's relief was immediate. Relief and a careful gratitude. A parking attendant at an event whose life she had touched with donations bent in a salutation that held a small new respect. It was as if the world was learning a pattern and measuring its obligations to her in increments. Testing required more than days of omission. It required action. She spent an afternoon in a hotel north of the city, in a suite whose soundproofing promised anonymity. She walked through rooms with the practiced attention of a woman who had learned to compute her public value, and yet kept a private economy of small transgressions. A stolen cigarette on a terrace, a novel read with the light off. The voice found her anyway, as if it had a map of her orbit mapped in something other than geography. It arrived with a clarity that belied any claim to randomness. You cannot be hidden in your own skin. At times, when she tried to imagine the watchers as something other than atmospheric metaphor, when she attempted to give them weight and form, she failed. They would not steady into image. The voice described them only as tendencies, small predations that liked to enter through loosened hems of attention. They were not monsters in the rooms of childhood tales. They were habits of the world she had never noticed before. The way a rumor finds its way to a dinner table. The manner in which an absence becomes a rumor. The manner in which a drift in facing could become a seam. To anthropomorphize them would be to domesticate what was not meant to be domesticated. The voice left them ambiguous, as it had to be. Ambiguity supplied leverage. Her private negotiations produced one firm, mortal fear, that her choice to anchor would make those in her orbit a potential target. It was an ethical question more urgent than her dislike of risk. Had she been the only one in danger, the calculus might have been simpler. But she had been surrounded for years, assistants who let sleep crash over conference room floors when crises demanded vigil, lovers who returned to the hotel with a lighter step, friends who wore her favors like ribbons. Those lives made the calculation knotty. To anchor would mean drawing a line of protection around them by locating herself as a tether. That tether might also attract the watchful interest of others. At the same time, something eased in her when she contemplated being intentional. There was power in naming and setting terms. She had always seen consent as a choreography, an agreed movement across a stage. This felt like that, only the stage was metaphysical. The choreography had stakes beyond headline risk. She polished terms as she had polished public statements, and polished language, a kind of rhetoric for a private covenant, sealed her resolve. Weeks passed, each night a slow reconsideration. She began to imagine the act of saying her childhood nickname aloud, not as surrender, but as reclamation. In her mind, the syllable came soft and bright. Nola. It was a name her grandmother had used to call her at the seaside when she was small, a name that fit into the mouth like a small, warm stone. Saying it was to take a vessel she had been selling in sections and name one of its chambers as still hers. That may be why, on the evening she chose, the ritual felt oddly domestic. She prepared the room as if preparing a bath. She had candles in crystal holders, a glass of water she pretended the voice liked, a small brass bell she had never used for anything more than an ornament. The curtains were drawn just so. The sliver the voice had asked for. The half-open seam where breath could be measured. She wore something unremarkable, a long-sleeved knit sweater that had been soft since a winter holiday. She wanted the feel of hometown against skin, not the wax of couture. The clock read 2:17. The voice was patient. It spoke only a few sentences, spare as a surgeon's notes. If you wish to anchor, say your name like you mean it. Not aloud to the world, aloud in this room. Let the sound be a vessel. She understood then that what she was being asked to do was both simple and impossible. The syllable would not only tether, it would configure an interior boundary, a slow binding that other things could feel. There is a strange audacity in the idea that a sound, given intent and heard in a particular place, could alter the architecture of being. She felt like a lawyer signing a document in the presence of witnesses that were invisible. "Nola," she whispered. The sound in the room folded differently than her usual private murmurs. It was not the polished, stage-managed name used at galas. It was a word like a part of the wood of the room itself. The candles trembled. For a heartbeat, the apartment was filled with the sense of being measured. Heat ran under her ribs as if a hand had pressed to the place where she imagined the voice lived. The voice answered not in language, but in sensation. A tightening at the edges of thought, a soft net drawn through the air. "You have named," it said, with a sound that felt like a clasp closing. The act of naming was not theatrical. There were no angels in the corners, no transformation of garments. Instead, there was a reconfiguring of attention. It was like the moment when a violin in an orchestra stops being one instrument and becomes the center of the composition. Others play around it differently. She felt the world reorder incrementally. A city that had been unmoored by attention now acknowledged a center. The first effect was practical and modest. That night, a figure that had lingered at the periphery of the building, a man who sometimes paced at 2 a.m. and whose attitude had always made her uneasy, stopped mid-step and moved along the other side of the block. She watched from behind the curtain, aware of the new geometry of the sidewalk. The man had not fled in panic. He had, somehow, recalibrated. The watchers reacted, and the reaction was measured. Some pulled back, some tilted, as if noting a course correction. Within days, the city's micro-habits adjusted. The barista's hands were steadier. The taxi driver's offers of a shortcut became courteous, rather than invasive. At an event where she might previously have been jostled by curious strangers, there was a gentle discretion in how people moved past her. Those small alterations were not the dramaturgy of magic. They were the slow political economy of a world that had learned new social parameters. But protection carried with it a subtraction. The first shifts were almost joyous, relief unspooling through tendon. Sleep came in deeper intervals. She stood in a room and felt less anxious when a siren wailed far away. She had, for the first time in months, the luxury of not pre-calculating every exit route. The voice kept to the agreements. There were no physical intrusions, no demands that she rearrange herself as a commodity. It was, if anything, a careful housekeeper. The cost registered in smaller, subtler ways. The first morning after naming, she made coffee and found the taste flatter than it had been a week ago. The bitter edge she usually enjoyed had been pared down, leaving something useful but less textured. She paused, thinking herself imaginary, then realized that the taste had changed in a way similar to the way a photograph bleaches when framed under the wrong glass. Memories, too, dulled. There were afternoons in which the precise colors of a childhood dress hazed. A joke she could have once repeated with exactness lost a little of its pinpoint brightness. It was not that she lost her memories. They were simply tempered, smoothed. The private joys that had once arrived like small fireworks were fewer. The voice, when she mentioned this in the hush that now existed between them, answered with economy. Anchoring produces edges. It stabilizes. That stabilization will, by necessity, narrow some of the stray arcs of sensation. The tone was almost apologetic. It offered a compensation. You will sleep more. Those in your orbit will be safer. You will not be easy prey. The moral complexity of the bargain nested like a set of Russian dolls. She took notes that read like minutes from a board meeting. Advantage, reduced risk, cost, loss of unmediated surprise. Friends noticed alterations in subtle social chemistry. A lover she dated for 2 months paused at dinner, tracing the rim of his glass with a fingertip, as if unsure whether to say something. "You seem calmer," he observed. There was curiosity, but also a muted distance, as though a kind of hut had been erected around her, and people were unable to sit quite as near the fire. Her aide, who had once spent a week sleeping on the office couch during a reputation crisis, took her aside with a quiet directness she rarely allowed herself in public. "You look like you're less available," she said. There was no accusation in it, only inventory. The aide's face showed the small calculation of someone who knew the employer's life intimately. If the principal was protected, what did that mean for the staff? Would operating around a tether make their work safer or more precarious? The socialite was conscious of being the point from which protective energies emanated. Sometimes at night she would lay awake and imagine the watchers circling for reason and, finding restraint, moving on. Other times she imagined them, relentless as tide, returning with ingenuity. The voice admitted what she feared. Containment signals a possible anchor. Other things will notice. A contained flame invites a candle snuffer and also curious hands. Not all consequences were negative. In public, journalists who had once written about her late nights with the predatory cadence of a scavenger now wrote with speculative tenderness about a mature reinvention. An editor sent a private note appreciating the steadiness in her recent speeches. She found herself hosting a quieter salon of thinkers and artists who preferred conversation to spectacle. The social life she curated did not end. It narrowed and became less combustible, like a bonfire confined within a stone ring. Yet the narrowing pressed on certain parts of herself. The socialite had long practiced the economy of surprising herself when necessary. An impulsive trip, a last-minute charity auction bid, an unsubtle remark that stunned cameras. Those impulses now required permission she could only feel in the edges of her life. There were evenings she would stand in front of the mirror and watch her reflection, as if observing the seam of a costume being sewn into a garment. How much of a person could be kept whole if the mind's tastes were muted into safety? Weeks after the naming, the watcher's interest mutated from curiosity into strategy. The voice kept its vigilance and informed her, not in diagrams, but as impressions. Formations had been noted at the city's margins, curious gatherings in alleys that commercial maps omitted. The watchers did not act like predators in a narrative with a climax. They behaved like organisms adapting. They adjusted their ways of testing until a weakness presented itself. The warning signs were minute. An uptick in a photographer's persistence. The sighting of a man who lingered on corners a block away. A social acquaintance who began showing an unusual appetite for information. The socialite honed her instincts again, doing the arithmetic of risk in the quieter idiom of a woman who had done harm control for a living. Avoid predictable routes, vary the hours of presence, keep those you love apprised enough to adapt. And then one night, the watchers changed tack. It was not frontal aggression. It was curiosity that took a different form. They tested her boundaries through the margins of her inner life. A dream arrived, clearer than usual. An architectural fantasy she had seen once before. A corridor that led to many doors, each door a version of a day she had once almost chosen. In the dream, the doors chimed with small bells each time she considered stepping toward them. She woke with the sound of a bell ringing somewhere in the apartment. The brass bell she kept on her mantel had been moved an inch to the left. The incident was small, but its meaning was large enough to break her sleep. The voice, when she mentioned it, said that those who want to know will test the seams, and testing sometimes begins with small incursions. They probe the soft edges of attention through dream work and through the daytime's minor slips. It was not necessarily malicious, it said. It was simply how the curious learned to be adept. We must be vigilant, it advised. It advised measures that were sometimes inconvenient. Change your schedule again. Keep the curtains more drawn during the low hours. Do not answer unknown numbers. Those sounded like much smaller sacrifices than naming had been. Still, the cumulative sense of being under structural management weighed on her. There was one evening that crystallized the moral line into a single new dread. A woman on a street near her building, someone who sold antiques from a cart, stopped when she saw the socialite, and for a moment the vendor's face registered a recognition that was not commercial. The woman reached up and touched the socialite's wrist in a way that seemed like a blessing. "Stay bright, love," she murmured. And the socialite felt a shiver of an old superstition. The crossing of a palm meant the passing of watchful attention. The voice noted the exchange in the quiet it reserved for facts. Anchoring radiates a signal. You attract those who will look for anchors of their own. The signal did not only attract creatures of intention, it altered the city's social grammar. A designer who had once coveted her for a patronage now asked, cautiously, whether she would consider a collaboration that would be measured and limited. Invitations came with clauses. Even generosity seemed to be rewritten as contractual custom. Her life, while safer, was becoming administratively refined. The final test that preceded any further movement came not from the street, but from within. A friend, whose life had been steady enough to avoid drama, called one night in tears because of a small stalker who had been following her blog comments and had begun to show up at local lectures. The friend asked, haltingly, whether the socialite could put out a word on her behalf. Perhaps a dismissal by a person of influence would be enough. It was a plea that tightened something like a vice around the socialite's chest. She saw then the real topography of the bargain. She had chosen to build protection from herself, and now her protective tether had become a resource asked of her by others. That evening she sat at her kitchen counter with a thermos of tea and watched the city take its slow breath. The mantel clock glowed 2:17. The voice offered counsel, not as command, but as the practical observation of experience. You cannot keep everyone, it said. You can build a harbor that shelters what is closest, but there are distances beyond which the influence of a tether frays. How did a person calibrate responsibility against self-preservation? There was a quality of lonely adulthood to such a question. Public lives are transactions regularly masked as gifts. When she considered the shape of herself now, less capricious, more guarded, she felt a sadness not unlike mourning. Mourning is the right word for what happens when you exchange a part of yourself for safety. It is the private conversation you have with your past selves. Time wore on in a peculiar way. The voice anchored to her days where it was permitted. A small hush in the afternoon, an answering patience when a loneliness grazed her like wind. It did not occupy all the rooms. It kept some chambers free as she'd insisted. Those rooms were often the ones where she still felt like an unedited person. A closet where she hid thrift store trousers. The small bathroom with cheap tiles where she hummed off-key. Yet the shape of her life had altered irrevocably. The watchers continued to learn. One night, a week after the friend's plea, she was at a small dinner with a group of curators and a documentary filmmaker whose work tracked marginal communities. Over the course of the conversation, the filmmaker mentioned, casually, and then with increasing interest, a neighborhood where people had begun to speak of strange keepers, individuals who, people said, had contracted their lives to resist the city's more ravenous elements. The filmmaker was not speaking of her specifically. He was not even aware of the particular knot, but she felt the moment like tide on dunes. Containment had become a motif for the city. To be a keeper suggested both strength and a new bureaucracy of obligations. She told the filmmaker nothing. She listened and felt the way a lantern sheds light and shade simultaneously. The voice said nothing about the conversation. Its silence was part of its character. It watched through her like a slow moon. Months passed, and her life settled into a rhythm that felt like a new species of living. There were nights still, when the curtains would stir and the clock would read 2:17, and she would consider whether she had traded the wrong thing for comfort. There were moments of a rare sweetness. Unhurried afternoons when she read long chapters of a book and did not feel the compulsion to imagine how another would respond on social media. There were also nights of a clinical melancholy, when the city's streetlights blurred like congealed stars, and she felt, a little, that she had been ironed smooth. Then the watchers made a move she had feared not in force, but in intelligence. It began with an image. In the space between sleep and wake one morning, she saw a vision of a narrow plaza where people moved in small, reverent lines. In the vision, a person whom she did not know lifted a small lamp and set it upon a ledge. Where the lamp touched the stone, a notice appeared. Almost as if a sign read that this place was taken. She woke with the sense that an idea had crossed from possibility into shared cognition. Containment was a strategy others could adopt. Shortly after, a rumor began to circulate in the lesser corners of social media that a new kind of security had been discovered by a woman who lived in a high-rise. The rumor was not precisely about her. It was phrased in the language of urban myth, but it carried the outlines of method and promise. People who read gossip and runes noticed the pattern and began to speculate openly about where and how such containment could be arranged. The watchers, always opportunistic, noted the rumor and regarded it like a tide reading a new leak in a coastal wall. In the weeks that followed, other signals emerged. A woman on a news channel, unknown, private, spoke in an offhand way about meditative measures that made her feel surrounded by a tidy sort of calm. A small spiritualist advertised a ritual that promised peaceful perimeters. The socialite, who had chosen containment not as spectacle but as a private counsel with a voice in the dark, now saw the technique leak into the city's rumor mill. Her choice had not been contained in the way she had intended. It had begun to radiate. The voice explained what had happened with the same economy and absence of moralistic language it had always used. Anchors are signals. Once containment has been performed in one place, it becomes intelligible to others. That intelligibility is a kind of contagion. It migrates through rumor, through architecture, through cultural hunger for certainty. Others will learn to bind and be bound. Some will manage the contract as she had. Others will attempt to take what they do not properly negotiate. She felt the knowledge like a weight she had not quite anticipated. Her private choice had public echoes. The city reorganized, incrementally, around the knowledge that containment was possible. She might have been relieved if containment had been a mercy no one would attempt again. Instead, it became a new grammar of power. Grants and charities that had once been open became selective. People who did not know how to name solitude began to ask for anchors, some with earnestness, others with opportunism. The socialite found herself receiving messages, not many, but enough to notice. Requests for introductions to the method. She handled them with the guarded courtesy she had developed. She deflected and protected. She knew now that the shape of protection she had chosen was not a charity to be dispensed. The watchers, several months after her naming, made their presence felt in a way that refracted into public life, rather than simply assailing it. A small string of accidents occurred in the outer boroughs. Nothing graphic, nothing dramatic. Reports of fixtures failing, of power lines tripping in ways city crews chalked up to old infrastructure. The voice reported these with the restrained language of taxonomy. Their attention is diverted sometimes by novelty. They still take through distraction when they can find it. They are also, the voice said, learners. They adapt their strategies when one type of approach is blocked. Perhaps the most disquieting change happened to her own perception. There were days when she looked in the mirror and saw a face which was undeniably hers, and yet belonged to a life narrowed by necessity. The sparkle that once arrived unbidden when she heard a swell of a certain chord in music was now rarer. When a child performed an impromptu song at a private event, the recognition that had once unfurled into a small public weep now registered more like a fondness than a rupture. She mourned those small openings, the lapses of armor that once made her feel alive, and felt also an odd gratitude for the steadiness that allowed her to sleep without fear. At certain late hours she would stand at the window and consider whether the bargain had been worth it. The river gleamed like a strip of dark silver. The clock below read 2:17, as it had every night since the beginning. The voice sat in the hush like a companion who had no need to be loved in return. It did not call itself guardian or friend with those human adjectives. It named itself by function. It held. In return, the socialite had a life that would not be so easily plucked. One spring night, as lilacs perfumed the air and the city began to unloosen the cold, she noticed a pattern of lights in the plaza across from her building. Lamps had been arranged not in the neat lines of municipal planning, but in a scattered chorus, each light placed with a deliberation she had begun to recognize as the watcher's new habit. They marked places. The watchers had learned. They experimented not by brute force but by cultural mimicry, placing light where there had been none so that curiosity would gather and create new seams. It was a slow, almost artistic strategy. It was also deeply effective. She called her aide and asked her to keep the house quiet for a few days. The aide obliged with a fidelity that seemed both professional and personal, as if she had chosen this life not only for tasks, but for the small stewardship of the woman who had become a tether. The aide's hands were precise as she adjusted curtains and reframed vases. The socialite felt simultaneously grateful and ashamed that she could not free those in her orbit from the consequences of her decisions. At the same time, the city had become a little kinder in mechanical things. A man who had once been aggressive on the subway offered her his seat one morning with a small, visible apology. It was not charity. It felt like newly learned habit. Rule systems shift, and the social fabric rearranged in small increments around the idea of protection and its costs. Years later, years that seemed to compress and extend depending on memory, there was a quiet public recognition of containment as a civic norm in certain neighborhoods. The language used to describe it was careful and bureaucratic. It argued for regulations and for systems that would prevent predation by the watchers. To her, the socialite, who had been first not by design but by personal desperation, such public conversations were a mixed blessing. On the one hand, a code would make the bargain less idiosyncratic and therefore possibly safer. On the other, codification would make her choice legible in ways she had not chosen. She continued to attend the parties she had always attended, but now with a moderation that felt like both grief and preservation. Her appearances were less incandescent than they had been in a past decade. She worked less under the pressure to astonish, and more under the obligation to steady. Staff and friends adapted. In time, some of the particular sensations she had lost, pleasures of certain small things, reconsidered a place in her life. People, it turned out, have a stubborn ability to recalibrate joy. The watchers, those creatures of the thin places, changed tactics yet again. A pattern of offerings began to appear in the city's margins. Small, inexpensive trinkets left on stoops, carefully composed notes stuck under doorways, brief flashes of images on neglected screens. Some interpreted the offerings as the city's new folklore, another art form springing from the long night. The voice said this was their method of learning culture. Place small things where attention might grow soft and then see what forms. If human cultures could be read, then they could also be influenced. The watchers, it said, were not exclusively predators. They were also experimenters of a cruel sort. On a humid night when the city smelled of baking bread and damp concrete, the socialite stood at her window and watched a group gather under one of those newly lit lamps. They were people in pairs and small clusters, laughing as if they had found alignment on something small and true. She recognized distantly the shape of what had once been a communal impulse, an impulse that felt like warmth and danger together. The voice told her simply, "Containment is contagious. People will make choices to anchor for reasons of love and loneliness alike." She thought of the future with a tired curiosity. If containment became common, what would the world become? Would the city ossify into neighborhoods of tethered people and neighborhoods of the untethered? Would certain bureaucracies form around the maintenance of anchors? She had not signed up to be a pioneer, and yet that was what she had been made. At last, the watchers responded to her anchoring not by frontal assault, but by a more abstract move. They began to look for new kinds of anchors. Those who were less likely to notice, less likely to demand conditions. Their attention shifted toward the marginal, toward the people who lived with small, private griefs and who might anchor without the public vocabulary the socialite had used. The voice reported this shift with a neutral tone. "There is a diaspora of interest," it said. "They will adapt to scarcity." The story could have ended there with a sense of grim triumph, the socialite safe, her life ordered, others learning the same defense. But endings in cities are never simple. In the months that followed, there were reports, here and there, of people who had anchored and then found their inner palates narrowed in the way she had. It was not universal. Some seemed to gain steadiness without a noticeable cost. The variation suggested an interplay of variables beyond her comprehension. The quality of the anchor, the depth of the naming, the particularity of the voice. She kept her consent agreements carefully in a drawer and reviewed them sometimes as if they were legal instruments that required updating. There was a day when she went into a room and could not recall the exact phrasing of a childhood joke. She found it in an old photograph, 2 children on a porch, and the laughter associated with it had a paler echo. She made herself sit with that grievance and let it be mourned. Mourning merits space. Grief in such cases is not a failure, but an accounting. Years passed with the patient, unglamorous work of maintenance. She continued to host salons that were small and serious. She continued to fund certain causes, the arts, the little emergency funds for workers in the city's cultural sector. She made sure the people closest to her had procedures for safety that did not rely solely on her involvement. She taught the aide, gently and with boundaries, how to spot the signs of unwanted interest, and how to enact small protections. She did not, in her public pronouncements, discuss the metaphysics that had altered her life. That would have been an invitation to a world she did not think the public could manage. The Watchers learned and adapted, and so did she. The city rebalanced itself around a new knowledge. Containment became a form of civic language, and the Socialite, once merely famous, became a private exemplar for an uncertain modern choreography, how to be seen and keep your inner rooms from being plundered. And yet the Watchers were never silent. They lingered in the city's peripheral myths, in the tales told late at night over cheap wine. Children who heard those tales would stand at their windows and imagine that light and signal could be bartered for in small ways. The Socialite, known to some as the woman who had named a private syllable to hold a dangerous company at bay, moved through her days with an attention tempered by the knowledge that containment invited curiosity. She had traded some of her spontaneous shine for a steady keel. She could not say unequivocally that it had been worth it. There were nights when she missed the reckless joy of being unmoored. The voice remained a presence in the hush of her skull. It did not talk as people talk. It commented sparingly on the practical matters that now governed the city's peripheries. It sounded, in small retrospects, like a thing that had been long used to the economy of waiting. It did not celebrate. It kept its promise to hold. One spring at dusk, a rumor reached her that a neighbor in a distant borough had varnished his porch and set a single lamp upon a step, and that men and women had come to sit around it and whisper of anchors and names. She thought of those lamp-lit gatherings as a new kind of social life, a ritualization of the work she had chosen to do alone. The image struck her as tender, and at the same time, as portentous. Containment grew in the city like a vine, whose growth requires careful tending and sometimes rends what it climbs. She had not wanted to start anything. She had wanted only to be known in a way that felt less like an object and more like a person. Naming had provided that knowledge and its cost. In the end, the moral did not unroll into a tidy epigraph. Life remained the messy negotiation it had always been. Choices made with partial knowledge, consequences that ripple beyond initial intention, and a city that learns and unlearns in turns. The mantel clock chimed its typical sound and read 2:17. She stood with her hand on the cool glass and watched a small group of people gather in the plaza across the street. One of them lifted a lamp and set it on a low column. A child, perhaps 6, leaned forward and pressed a coin into a small crack in the stone. The coin glinted. The Watchers, somewhere in the invisible seams of the city, adjusted their course like weather. The voice in her head spoke in the patient register of fact. Containment is an idea now. When ideas spread, so do their predators and their keepers alike. She realized with a clarity that came like a small ache, that the future was not one of absolute victory or defeat. It was a horizon of unfinished bargains. She folded her hands, feeling the muscles of habit she had taught herself to keep, and allowed the quiet to pool around her like oil. There was safety. There was loss. There was care to be taken. Outside, the Watchers noted the lamp and tilted toward it, not in unison, but in the slow, calculating way of animals learning a promising new food source. Inside, in the dim room, she whispered her private name once more, not as a plea, but as a record. Nola. The clock ticked. The curtains moved like a contented animal taking breath. The city breathed on, its margins rippling with the news that containment existed, and that, where there is knowledge, there will be effort, to replicate, to profit, to protect, to prey. She was not merely the socialite who had been seduced by a secret. She was part of the secret's spread, a small, deliberate ember in a larger darkness. The protection had cost her a breadth of feeling. It had also bought those she could hold a kind of steadiness. The Watchers watched and learned. The city reshaped itself around a new grammar. Her life, like a well-tended room, remained open to those she trusted and closed to those she did not. At 2:17, she turned off the light and let the curtains fall. The voice did not push. It only held what she had bargained for. Beyond the glass, at the edge of her block, a shadow, thin and deliberate, moved past the new lamp. It paused, as the hunters of the small city often do, and chose a path. The Watchers had not been driven away. They had only been taught that anchors exist. In the learning, both possibility and peril spread like a quiet map. She lay down and listened to her heart, a modest drum in the dark. The price of being known had been paid in small private coin. She had anchored herself, and in anchoring she had become, for the first time in a long while, a woman with a measure of peace and a measure of sorrow. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and newly attentive. Inside, the voice kept its vigil, and somewhere beyond sight, the watchers recalculated. The future, as it ever does, waited with its own soft, relentless curiosity. If this spoke to you, follow for more stories that live in the thin hours where glamour and the uncanny meet.